Welcome to another episode of Prime and Load. In 2009, I joined the United States Marine Corps. And ever since, I've had the incredible opportunity to travel the world, meet amazing people, and do things and experience things I will never forget. But no matter where I've been in the past 15 years, one day has always stood out. November 10th, the Marine Corps birthday. This year, we're celebrating with Major General Jason Bohm as we explore the earliest history of the Marine Corps. From first recruitment to conflicts with the Continental Army, raids on English soil, and monumental American victories. I'm Lee Gugino, joined as always by Dr. Alex Burns and Andrew Bamford. Thank you for joining us for Washington's Marines. So first off, I have to say happy birthday, because this is November 10th, and this is a very special episode for me personally. Today we're going to be talking about Continental Marines and the Marine Corps history at the start of the American Revolution. So, sir, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, it's my pleasure, gentlemen, and thank you for having me. I can't think of a better day to do it than the 250th.
Before we get into the history stuff, can you kind of give us a little bit of a background to your career? You've been in the Marine Corps for a while.
Sure. Well, I served on active duty for 34 years, and it all started back when I was in grade school, actually. In my school library growing up in New York, we had a section of books where oversized books were kept, and there was an American Heritage book there on the American Civil War. And I was just fascinated by this book, which was my initial interest in the military. And then I went to the bookshelf, and the first book I ever read cover to cover was a book called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, concerning the Doolittle Raid of World War II. And Doolittle Raid happened in the Pacific Theater after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which really piqued my interest in the Pacific Theater. And of course, who was romping and stomping across the Pacific throughout World War II but United States Marines? And that's where I first gained an interest in becoming a Marine. And really what drove that was I wanted to serve my country. I wanted to be able to give back to a country that provided us freedoms and liberties, and understanding that those did not come free. We have to earn our freedoms and re-earn our liberties every day in the service to our communities and to our country. So it was a perfect fit for me. And then I just added my love of history on top of that. It was a relationship built in heaven, quite frankly. So just enjoyed 34 years of service. By trade, I'm an infantryman, but as is often the case in the Marine Corps, we're a small but powerful force, and you will be asked to do many things that you were not necessarily trained or prepared to do. So we train our people to be flexible, adaptable problem solvers. And we have a saying that we do windows. We do whatever the nation needs us to do, regardless of what resources or lack thereof or education and training we may have, but we train people to thrive in those environments. So I've been very blessed to be able to do that over these last 34 years.
That's awesome. Sir, I know in my experience in the Marine Corps history seems to start on November 10th and then skip to Guadalcanal. And so what got you interested in this very, very early period that oftentimes gets overlooked?
Well, that exact reason that you stated, Lee, and that's because I know that the Marine Corps has a very rich and illustrious history for 250 years, but there was a huge gap in my own understanding of the Corps' history. And for those who don't know, Marines, regardless of where you are in the world, will celebrate the Corps' birth every November 10th, regardless of your circumstances. I can remember being in a combat situation where we had nothing more than a pound cake from our meals ready to eat and sticking a match inside of it and lighting it and singing happy birthday to the Corps. But no matter where you are, what your circumstances, you're going to recognize that history and tradition. So understanding how important that is to the Corps, and my own lack of understanding, as a leader, we're supposed to lead by example. We're supposed to share information about our Corps and its history, because we refuse to let those who went before us down. You know, we have a responsibility to continue that rich legacy. So I started my own self-study program. And at one point, I was the director of the Marine Corps Expeditionary Warfare School. And that's where I actually started having the opportunity, not being operationally committed, to really start doing some deep dive analysis and study of the history right there where the Marine Corps History Division is located in Quantico, Virginia. And it was extraordinary because what I found is a lot of the myths that we teach our young Marines are actually not true. And I'll give you an example of that. Many people refer to Major Samuel Nicholas as being the first commandant of the Marine Corps. And in fact, if you go in the Pentagon, in the commandant's own hallway in the Pentagon, it has a painting of Samuel Nicholas identifying him as the first commandant. Not true, because Congress did not bestow the title commandant on the Marine Corps until 1798, well after the end of the American Revolution. As just one example. Tun Tavern is another, if you want to talk about that a little bit more into our conversation.
We'll definitely have to get into that, sir, for sure, because we're striking at the hearts of the Marine Corps here a little bit. But I have to admit, I totally agree with you. There's on my last deployment in Camp Fuji, right before our Christmas leave, I did a PME on the Trenton and Princeton campaign, a very brief one. But afterwards, there was a lot of, wow, Sergeant, I didn't know that, and a lot of interested Marines. So I believe if Marines learn the right thing, they're often more interested than they realize. Getting into kind of what the heck is a Marine, sir? And I know that might seem like a very basic question, but can you describe kind of the roles and capabilities of Marines, or more generally naval infantry as a concept?
Sure. So at its very basic roots, we have soldiers who are focused on fighting in the land domain. We have sailors who are focused on fighting on the maritime domain, but you need somebody that can bridge the gap between the two. Naval forces are power projection forces, but a ship can only go so far in its ability to touch actions on the ground through back in the 18th century through the max effective range of its cannons. So it would need a force, and that force could be made of sailors, but if you're pulling sailors off the ship in order to conduct ground operations, then they're obviously not available to run the ship, and if an enemy fleet shows up, you're in a hurt locker. So you need a force that has skills both to operate on the seas, but also on the land. They can fight like sailors, and in fact, Continental Marines did man the cannons, and they were able to run the sails and riggings as well if needed to do that, in addition to providing for the good order and discipline of the ship, protecting the captain from mutinous activity, etc. But they also had the ability to land ashore and conduct limited maritime operations as part of a larger naval campaign to extend the reach of the Commodore in charge of that fleet in order to prosecute our national interest. And that's the Marine Corps at its very basic principles of what it stands for.
Prior to the Marine Corps actually being established, do American colonists have any sort of naval service experience or Marine Corps naval infantry service even before the American Revolution starts?
Yes, absolutely. So, if you think about what is the original origin of Marines, they weren't always called Marines. You used the term naval infantry as well, but it goes all the way back to ancient times. In fact, the Romans would use something called a corvus, in which they would bring their warships close to the enemy, have a plank with a hook on it that would drop and latch on to the enemy ship, to allow soldiers or naval infantry that were on their ships run across that plank and capture the enemy ship before cannons were even created. So that same concept has been at play since the start of time, and we had people doing war on the waters, whether it's in rivers or on the oceans. So as the American colonies were established, we were obviously a British colony, so several American citizens, although born and raised in America, were still fighting for England all the way up until the revolution began in 1775. So there were Americans that had served on British warships as British Marines. And this is another thing that I learned in my research is we don't refer to them officially as Royal Marines until 1802. So a lot of people write in American Revolution history, including myself when I first began, referring to British Marines as Royal Marines, but that would be false for the American Revolution. But British Marines had within their ranks some American citizens who were fighting on behalf of the king, as well as in the army, and then as sailors with the Royal Navy as well. So we gritted our teeth, if you will, fighting for the king initially. And in fact, the United States Marine Corps is modeled off of the British and future Royal Marines, and even to this day have a very close working relationship with them. And if you go, for example, to the Commandant's home at 8th and I, Marine Corps Barracks, Washington, D.C., you'll see a lot of Royal Marine memorabilia inside those buildings there as well, because of that tight relationship that existed back then and still today.
And so if we can move into the actual creation of the American Marine Corps, can you kind of give us a lowdown on why Congress even established the Marine Corps?
So at its very basic principle, again, is, a lot of people don't realize that America is actually a maritime nation. And if you think about it, it's very obvious. We have two major oceans on either flank, and our country is inundated with rivers. And back then in the 18th century, it was the river system that was a more effective and efficient way to transport people and things, as opposed to the very crude road system that existed. So needing maritime forces would be critical to prosecuting the war. George Washington understood that, the Congress understood that, but the conflict that occurred starting at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, and then putting the British under siege in Boston, where the New England militia came in and put the British under siege. That immediate crisis precipitated the Continental Congress on first focusing on establishing a Continental National Army. They did that, and then the necessity for blocking British reinforcements and supplies from coming over from England, and also to capture those same items that were needed by the Americans, because a lot of our war materials before the war were actually provided by England. We needed warships to be able to capture those goods. So on October 13th of 1775, Congress created the Navy, when it actually directed General George Washington to purchase 2 merchant vessels to convert into warships to capture British merchantmen that were coming across the sea. And they had some good intelligence on a small convoy that was on its way to Quebec, specifically to create that first Navy. Unfortunately, there weren't any ships in New England in order to purchase, because many of the ships were being used as privateers, and nobody wanted to join a national navy at that time. Still strong state, or at this time colony feelings, not a national united colonies. So those efforts to create the Navy were pushed further south into Philadelphia. We could talk about that in a bit. But it was an event that occurred a month later that precipitated the creation of the future United States Marine Corps. And that was on November 2nd, 1775, the people of the town of Passamaquoddy, Nova Scotia, which was a British hold-in, contacted the Continental Congress and asked to become part of the affiliation of the North Americans fighting for their freedoms and liberties. Congress was salivating. They saw this as an opportunity to bring Canada in as a 14th colony, but they had to figure out how they could make that happen. And if you know your history of the American Revolution, the principal Royal Navy operating base was in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And so the people of Passamaquoddy not only asked to be considered to become part of the North American consolidation of colonies, but they also recommended that a naval campaign be executed in order to capture the British base at Halifax, Nova Scotia. Well, the Congress understood that this would be a naval campaign requiring a landing force to land on Nova Scotia and capture this enemy port. So it was the catalyst, if you will, who resulted in a committee called the Naval Committee, later renamed the Marine Committee, that met in a second-story room of a well-known building called the Tun Tavern in November of 1775. And that is the true reason why Tun Tavern is considered the birthplace of the Marine Corps. It's because the congressional committee that created the Marines met in that building. Not what most people think, because it was the principal recruiting office, because that did not occur until the following year in 1776, when the owner of Tun Tavern, a gentleman named Robert Mullen, was commissioned a captain of Marines, and he utilized his own tavern as a recruiting station. But John Adams, John Langdon, and Silas Deane were part of this committee that met in the second-story room of Tun Tavern. On the 9th of November, they created a plan on how to execute this naval expedition to capture Halifax. They presented that to the full Congress on November 10th, who then passed that plan and resolved to create a Continental Marine force that would consist initially of 2 battalions to be known forevermore as the 1st and 2nd Battalion of Continental or American Marines. And that was the catalyst for creating the Marines. But then the problem was, where do they come from? How are we going to form this force? And their solution to that was their solution for everything at the time: give that problem to General George Washington. So they actually assigned George Washington with responsibility for cherry-picking soldiers out of his army battalions, holding the British under siege, that had seafaring experience, to be able to create these 2 battalion of Continental Marines. Well, Washington had just assumed command of the army. As you know, he was trying to kludge together the 4 New England colonies into a cohesive fighting force. We had the first fully recruited soldiers coming from Maryland and from Pennsylvania. Riflemen under Dan Morgan came up to join him. So he's trying to bring this force together, give it some standards, give it some training, try and find the resources to create it. He did not have the bandwidth to create this whole other entity of Continental Marines. So he balked at the idea. And he contacted John Hancock, who was president of the Continental Congress at the time, and said, "John, I can't do it. No mas, brother. I got too much going on. I don't have the manpower I need, and I don't have the resources I need. And oh, by the way, the Congress assigned Washington with leading the naval expeditionary to capture Halifax. And he said, by the way, my hands are full in Boston. I can't do it." So John Hancock acquiesced, and the Congress said, "Okay, George, settle down. You stay focused on Boston and what's going on there, and we will take it upon ourselves as the Congress to lead the effort to recruit these Marines on our own and create a separate and standalone force from the Continental Army and from the Continental Navy, but they will work for the fleet." And so it was 3 days after that letter came from Passamaquoddy, Nova Scotia, that the Congress commissioned the first Marine officer, a gentleman you know, Lee, named Samuel Nicholas. And so Nicholas became the first Marine officer, and also the first Marine recruiter, because his job was to go out and recruit his force. But what happened there as well is they deemed very quickly that the Continental Congress did not have an understanding of what would be required to conduct this naval campaign to capture Halifax. They wanted Washington to create this force, train it, man it, move it, and execute this operation within 22 days after receipt of the orders to do so. There was no way it was absolutely possible. So they also canceled the naval campaign to capture Halifax, but they did understand that they did need this body of Marines to operate with the fleet. And so they changed the plan to not create two full battalions of Marines, but 10 separate companies of 50 Marines each, which would serve as Marine companies or Marine detachments assigned to the ships of the fleet. And that is how the Marines began the war.
So, General, you kind of referenced that Washington had a lot on his plate and was sort of writing to Congress saying he didn't want to be involved. Would you say that, by and large, throughout the course of the war, he was pretty supportive of the Marines as an institution?
So I'm going to hurt some feelings here, but my answer is no. Okay? And the answer to that question of why is the same answer why today Army generals don't appreciate the Marine Corps. And that is because it all comes down to resources. Okay? And the Navy, the Army, and the Marine Corps were all challenged throughout the American Revolution to find the manning to fill their ranks, to man their crews, to be able to put their ships to sea. There were ships that were held in port for over a year due to the lack of manpower. And so it's not that Washington didn't like the Marines. It's just that Washington saw the Marines as a draw and a drain on the resources he needed to prosecute his operations ashore.
That's fascinating. I always sort of give this in a brief lecture, 3 or 4 sentences in the course of my first half of American history course, and I have some Marines who are in OCS and things like that at my university, and I always try to sort of make them feel a little better by saying that Washington looked up to his older half-brother Lawrence, of course, as you note in your book, General, was himself a Marine for the British back in the 1740s. But it sounds like maybe that he loved his older half-brother Lawrence a lot. I mean, I think he probably inspires Washington to go into the military in some ways. But that sentimental connection doesn't necessarily roll over into the Marine Corps getting a lot of what they need in the Revolutionary War.
No, and in fact, if you know your overall American history, you'll know that George Washington, Harry S. Truman, and President Dwight D. Eisenhower all tried to disestablish the Marine Corps. And oh, by the way, what do they all three have in common? They're all general officers in the Army. Because no matter what time frame it is, including 2025, there's a fight for limited resources, and everyone's trying to look out for their own equities. And that is part of the reason why we came up with the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 to create the joint force in order to diminish the negative impact of the nepotism that was being seen and the parochialism being seen between the services fighting for those limited resources.
Could I just dive in with an extra question as well? I suspect this is maybe more to clarify things for ignorant Brits like me, but you mentioned, or you referred to the Continental Navy a couple of times as a fleet, and I guess as a whole it was, but and I'm certainly not meaning to belittle the scale of
fleet is a relative term, man.
Yeah, sure. This is kind of where I was going. I mean, we're very much in an inverted situation now, and I'm certainly not trying to belittle building a navy out of nothing, but my understanding would be correct. We're talking at the most of maybe 3 or 4 ship squadrons, single ship operations, that sort of scale, in terms of what the Continental Navy is actually doing.
Well, the reason I call it a fleet is because I mentioned that Washington could not find ships for purchase in New England. He recommended looking around Philadelphia. So the Congress did purchase 7 ships initially, and those 7 ships were all converted merchantmen, the largest of which was a ship called the Alfred, a 20-gun sloop, if you will. We didn't even raise to the level of frigates yet. And that was the command ship or the flagship for the fleet under a new gentleman named Isaac Hopkins, who is identified as the commander-in-chief of the Navy at the time and would be our first fleet commodore. I call it a fleet because the first consolidation of ships that went to sea to prosecute the war were these 7 warships under Isaac Hopkins. And you could call it an armada, you could call it a squadron. I refer to it as the fleet only because it was the fleet commander, if you will, or the commander-in-chief of the Navy who was in command of that group of ships that went down to New Providence to prosecute the first amphibious assault in American history. And oh, by the way, Isaac Hopkins was the only individual to receive the designation of Commander-in-Chief of the Navy. After that, after his firing, because he did not perform up to expectations, and not on that initial operation, but later in the war, they rescinded that title to him and never gave it to another overarching commander of the Navy. It was the Congress dealing directly with individual ship captains after that point. At certain points, the senior captain in a consolidation of a group of ships would lead what you could better refer to as an armada or a squadron in conducting a limited operation together before they would then split and go their separate ways. So your point is valid, Andrew.
So we have the Marine Corps established, and now Samuel Nichols has to recruit his Marines. Now, I think my first question is, did Samuel Nichols actually set out to be a Marine Corps officer, or was this kind of the commission he was given? And then who are the men he actually recruits? We talk a lot about the makeup of the private soldiers in many, many armies. What did these first Marines, who were they?
So the Marines, every Marine except one, I believe, were immigrants from Europe. And all of them came from the Philadelphia area. And as you can imagine, had some experience at sea. So they wanted to be able to start things running. They did not have a formal school. They did not have a formal training plan. It was OJT. You learned as you went. So they needed people who could at least get on a ship and know their way around, understand the terminology and that type of thing. So Nicholas, Tun Tavern is literally located right on the waterfront of the Philadelphia wharfs. So as you can imagine, he was connected to the seas. Many of his customers were those who went to sea because his clientele was right there at the wharfs in front of his establishment. And Nicholas himself, which was often the case, the other thing he had going for him and why he received a commission is because he was a prominent citizen in the community. They didn't just take people off the streets unless they had some type of connection politically or through family. Nepotism was alive and well throughout the American Revolution. Favoritism, sometimes that overrode actual competence and knowledge and experience. And it led to disaster in many times because of that. And in fact, over the course of the first 2 years, really, George Washington struggled with this, as did the Navy, and they were able to start weeding out those who were given commissions for the wrong reason. But Nicholas proved to be a competent leader and successfully led the first amphibious assault, captured Fort Nassau and Fort Martingale down in New Providence, Bahamas. It wasn't a fight, to be honest. The British fired 3 cannons, really just as a demonstration of not being cowards before they abandoned Fort Martingale, and then the Marines were able to capture Fort Nassau without firing a shot. But conducting an amphibious operation is a complex evolution. They did not do it well, but they started the learning process. And that's no different than the Marine Corps today. We're actually redesigning the Marine Corps today using the Commandant's guidance on something called Force 2030 or Force Design. And he, in fact, will tell you that this is an iterative process. We're going to experiment. We're going to put some new capabilities out there. We're going to test the waters on things, and we're going to have a campaign of learning to improve as we go. And that was certainly out of necessity what the Continental Marine, the Navy, and the Army had to do at the start of the war.
And so, sir, you mentioned that these Marines are already have training at sea in some capacity. And I know today you don't accidentally walk into a Marine Corps recruiting office, but at this point in history, what made these men become Marines instead of sailors?
Yeah, so I think the reasons that people became Marines during the American Revolution are the same reasons they do today. So first of all, if you're going to have to be the expert of operating at sea and at land, you could argue that you might need a little bit extra skills. There's probably a little bit more travel and adventure associated with that because you're not stuck to the monotony of operating on a ship. You actually get to land ashore. There was the promise of prize money. And in fact, the second highest paid individual on the ship was the Marine detachment commander, to demonstrate the fact that Marines received the same percentage of prize monies as their equivalent in the Navy did, but the officers actually got a little bit more. So it would be enticing for the officers to do that. And then I'm sure many of them were just patriotic Americans and wanted to do their part and serve their country. And they understood where their skill set lay and where they could best contribute to the war effort. And I think that probably had a lot to do with it as well.
And so you mentioned also earlier about some people may have had some qualms about joining a national Marine Corps service. Were there colonial level Marine Corps through different colonies?
Yeah, absolutely. So there weren't different colonial Marine Corps, but what there were, well, yes, you could say each colony established its own militia, as everyone's aware. Several of them had their own navies at a necessity because the Continental Navy was not established at the beginning of the war. And once it was established, was focused elsewhere, not necessarily on protecting the colony and later states' own home ports. So they created their own navies at a necessity for that purpose. And if you have a Navy, you need the Marines to serve with the Navy. So there were many state Marines as well. So there were actually 4 different groups that comprised the Marines during the American Revolution. The first were, I mentioned, privateers earlier. And privateers were sanctioned pirates, if you will, who received letters of marque from the Congress to go out and capture British warships or merchantmen. They primarily focused on merchantmen, but they too used commercial merchant ships that they converted over to be warships. And many of the privateers were far more powerful than a lot of the Continental Navy warships. And they had a lot of success. There was a promise of short cruises, less discipline, but more prize money. So that was very attractive to many people that lived in the port areas. And again, as I said, there was a huge drain on manpower because a lot of people were going to become privateers instead of joining the formal Navy and Marine Corps. But there were privateer Marines who served. Second, there were colonial, then later state Marines that were established. An example of this is Pennsylvania had its own Navy that operated at sea and also on the Delaware River. And on the Delaware River, they had 2 floating batteries, one called the Putnam and one called the Arnold, each manned with 12 18-pound cannons. The full crews of both of those floating batteries were manned by Pennsylvania Marines. And Pennsylvania Marines would, and it was not uncommon for people to serve in multiple different services. Sometimes it was just where the action was and they wanted to follow the action. Other times it was because once one enlistment was up, they would get a sign-on bonus from another service or whatever the circumstances may be. But for example, one of the gentlemen was named Thomas Forrest, who commanded one of those floating batteries. He transferred over to Colonel Proctor's Continental Army Artillery and participated in Trenton and Princeton and was actually the other battery commander at the top of King and Queen Street in the Battle of Trenton, one being Alexander Hamilton, the other was Thomas Forrest, former Pennsylvania State Marine, now fighting for the Continental Army as a battery commander. So privateer Marines, state Marines, and then there were also the Continental Marines, who were the only ones that were formally recruited to serve for the National Army. So several different groups depending on your circumstances. And not only did people switch services, but they also went from fighting for their states to fighting for the the national forces, whether it's Army, Navy, or Marine Corps as well. So it gets fairly complex at times trying to keep track of where people are and what their rank is at the time, because sometimes they didn't keep their ranks as they shifted from force to force, and then sometimes even switch into completely different services again, from Navy to Army or Marines.
General, so we just had a career day at the small Catholic university I'm at in Ohio, and there was a Marine recruiter on campus for that career day alongside an Army recruiter, and I could look at the uniforms and tell which one was the Marine, which one was the soldier. Were the uniforms or the equipment that the Marines received in this period distinct at all from the rest of the Continental Army? Could an American tell just by looking at a Marine, oh, that's a Marine, he's not a soldier?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when the war began, there was no prescribed uniform. Just like the Minutemen that responded to Lexington and Concord, come as you are, carry the weapon that you have at home. The initial Continental Marines that deployed down to New Providence with Samuel Nicholas and Isaac Hopkins did not have prescribed uniform. In fact, some of them wore captured British Hussar uniforms, light infantry uniforms, because that's all they had. And as you know, cloth wears out quickly, particularly if you're doing a lot of physical activity. So it's all they had at the time. It was not until September of '76 that the Continental Congress prescribed a formal Marine, Continental Marine uniform. And that was with a green frock as opposed to several of the Army units. And as you know, primarily Army wore the blue tunics, but depending on what state you were from and what your circumstances were, they wore all different kinds of uniforms. But the prescribed Marine uniform was a black round hat and a green overcoat with buff vest and also breeches. But oftentimes, again, it was only if they had the ability to find the materials to produce those uniforms. In fact, there's, one of the myths I haven't been able to debunk or prove that it was true was that Betsy Ross, who made the first American flag, actually, because she was in Philadelphia, seamstress, had worked on Continental Marine uniforms as well. Yeah, but I do know, for example, when John Paul Jones was operating in European waters, he manned his Marine detachment on board the Ranger in red coats because he was going to conduct limited operations ashore, taking the fight to British homelands, and that way they could gain a moment of confusion in who they engaged to determine whether they were actually enemy or not, which could give them the advantage in a battle.
And General, is there anything distinctive about their equipment or armament? I mean, are they carrying the same sort of like firelocks that the rest of the Continental Army is carrying, or are they issued with like swords or cutlasses or something, or something like that?
Yeah. So actually, the Congress in identifying the uniform also identified the prescribed weapons. Ultimately, what it came down to is what's available. So Marines fought with normal brown besses that they could capture from the British. They fought with the prescribed weapon for a Marine was called and I'm probably pronouncing this incorrectly, but a frus. It's a shortened musket because you're operating on the ship in confined areas. They didn't want that longer weapon. They also had cutlasses. Benedict Arnold, and I'm sorry, but I forgot to mention this fourth group of Marine were soldier Marines, because both George Washington and Benedict Arnold created their own navies, one operating off of Boston and New York with Washington, and on Lake Champlain with Benedict Arnold, and they pushed soldiers into operating as Marines. And one of the things that Benedict Arnold did in manning his soldier Marines was specifically gave them blunderbusses, which put out a wide shot like a 12-gauge shotgun. And what I found interesting is the Congress also prescribed long pikes for the Marines. And you could imagine that could be a very effective weapon if you have British Marines trying to board an American ship and being able to jam them before they can make it across, or also strike British defenders as the Marines are getting ready to do a boarding of a British vessel. Again, it was a mix of whatever was available at that time, although they tried to prescribe the weapon systems. And one other very effective weapon that the Marines used fighting from the fighting tops was the hand grenade. And a lot of people don't realize that hand grenades were used all the way back to ancient times and very effectively in the American Revolution. And in fact, you could argue that it was a Continental Marine throwing a hand grenade into an open hatch on the Serapis that resulted in John Paul Jones and a Bohm Richard, even though it was sinking and Jones was asked if he's ready to strike his colors, that when that grenade fell down inside the gun decks of the Serapis, it caught some gunpowder, ignited it, which created a chain reaction of explosions down to the gun deck, which you could say ultimately resulted in that victory for the Americans.
Awesome. And like you said, sir, I'm assuming that the Continental Marines are facing a lot of the supply issues and shortages that the Army is as well.
Yes, absolutely. And so a lot of people don't give the Navy credit for arming the Continental Army. But whether it was privateers or whether it was actual Continental Navy ships, hundreds and hundreds of British vessels were captured during the war, and there were much needed war supplies that were captured and then therefore transferred ashore and provided to Washington and his army. I would be lying if I didn't think that they cherry-picked the best out of that equipment before they sent it ashore to be able to man themselves and equip themselves first. But the point is, there was plenty to go around whenever they did capture these holes filled with that equipment and uniforms and food and liquor in some cases, too.
Yeah, I mean, Lee, one of the units we're thinking about reenacting for the 250th anniversary is the 26th Continental Infantry, is equipped in exactly that manner, right? They're equipped with British muskets that are captured on ships. Yeah.
Yep. And the other regiment we recreate goes for a few years without uniforms for that exact same reason.
They were taken. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. And so, sir, I'd like to kind of shift gears to talking about some of the Marines' first engagements. And you mentioned a few of them. How do the Marines kind of first cut their teeth in combat?
Yeah, so the first combat for them, again, was the operation or the cruise that the First Fleet did under Aesop Hopkins down to New Providence, Bahamas. And it's actually an extraordinary story because the Continental Congress was really trying to find their way about how to lead an armed forces. And in fact, there's a letter that I quote my next book coming out from John Adams that basically admits, hey, we don't know what we're doing. We're figuring it out as we go. And so the initial orders that Aesop Hopkins got when he went to sea, he had 2 sealed envelopes. One of them contained orders, direction, and guidance on how to maintain good order and discipline with the fleet. The other one was very ambitious. It said, once you head to sea, we want you to immediately go south to the Virginia Capes. We want you to locate, close with, and destroy the British fleet operating off of the Virginia Capes. Okay, again, these are nascent Navy, first time ever, no training, using converted merchantmen against British warships and frigates and not very many men of war. The British primarily used frigates and smaller vessels because the men of war could run aground if operating in close-in coastal waters. They saved those for the French later in the war. But it was a suicide mission, basically, if they were to do that. So, but it got better. They said, once you're done defeating the British off the Virginia Capes, we want you to further go down to the Carolinas, locate, close with, and destroy the British fleet operating off of the Carolinas. And then once that's done, if that's not enough, then go north off of Rhode Island, Block Island, locate, close with, and destroy the British operating there. Basically clear the whole eastern seaboard of the British menace. Well, Hopkins is looked at going, are you flipping kidding me? But there was one caveat in his orders that said, and oh, by the way, if bad weather or other circumstances prevent you from doing these things, use your best judgment in what you choose to do. So Hopkins had reliable intelligence that said that there was an enormous amount of gunpowder and ordnance being stored down in New Providence, Bahamas. And in fact, Fort Nassau and Fort Matangao back in the 1740s was commonly known to be one of the strongest defended areas for the British Empire in the American theater and the West Indies down south. But once the war began, they started shifting the regular troops up to fight on the American mainland, leaving only militia forces down in New Providence under a guy named Governor Brown. But the gunpowder and the ordnance remained there. So Hopkins understood that Washington was critically short of gunpowder holding the British under siege in Boston. In fact, if you do your research, you'll know that there was only enough gunpowder to man each American soldier holding the British under siege with 9 cartridges, which basically would run out very quickly in one battle and the war could be over. So Washington was playing this very fine game of how much he could engage and how much he had to preserve to defend himself if necessary. So Hopkins used his initiative to go down and capture the ordnance located down in New Providence. Unfortunately, what happened was their presence was known before they got down there. And in fact, the operation was such that they met at Abaco Island and rendezvoused there before pushing the further remaining 50 miles south to go to New Providence. And the plan was that Samuel Nicholas was going to lead the consolidated, and this is how the Marines operated. They would take the Marine detachments on board individual ships and kludge them together to form a battalion for limited operations ashore. Once that operation was complete, they would then push their Marine detachments back to their ships. So there were 231 Marines on this first deployment that were given to Nicholas. And oh, by the way, Nicholas put himself in command of the flagship's Marine detachment on board the ship Alfred. And just as a side note, there was a little-known guy named John Paul Jones, who was the first lieutenant of the Alfred at the same time. This is where John Paul Jones first really gained an appreciation of what Marines and a landing force can do. It's his first engagement with them, and he would use them very effectively later in the war. But what happened was the ships, because of the winds, pushed too far south. They got spotted by Governor Brown, who used that one last day of preparation to evacuate the majority of the gunpowder to western Florida. However, the rest of the ordnance was still there. They maintained a limited number of gunpowder barrels there because he was afraid if there was nothing there, it would tick the Americans off and they would burn the whole city down or the village down. So what happened was once they were spotted, Aesop Hopkins gave Samuel Nicholas 50 sailors to also go ashore to reinforce him because of the alert already being out with the militia forces ashore in the Bahamas. Well, again, the Marines landed the next day at a place called New Guinea. They moved towards Fort Matangao at first. The British, as you were, Governor Brown told them, the people holding that fort, fire 3 rounds to show basically that we're not cowards and we put up a good fight, and then evacuate and come to Fort Nassau, which was 4 miles further away. They did that. The Marines captured the Fort Matangao on the first night. And I have to be critical of Samuel Nicholas here because he did not press the attack on the first day. If he had pressed the attack on the first day, he may have captured Fort Nassau that night and captured much of that gunpowder that was being evacuated that same evening. However, what they did catch when they caught Fort Nassau the next day, and this is a little known factoid as well, is they caught 88 cannons and 15 mortars. That exceeds the number of cannons that Henry Knox brought from Fort Ticonderoga, which enabled Washington to convince General Howe that he needed to evacuate Boston. The difference is that as the Marines were heading south, Henry Knox's cannons showed up before Aesop Hopkins and the fleet could deliver those cannons to General Washington. So instead of those cannons going to Boston, they were disseminated to several ports to protect the ports. And all that was left, and it's a much larger story, were those 15 mortars to give to Washington. But it was a successful operation. As the fleet pushed north following this amphibious assault, they went up to Rhode Island, to Block Island, and this is where they had their first battle at sea. And there were 6 American warships at the time. They had captured a couple of British ships en route, merchantmen, and the HMS Glasgow, a British frigate, was seen in the evening, and there was a battle that was ensued. And in fact, the battle was initiated by a Marine, because one of the ships, American ships, was named the Cabot. And the Cabot was the first to approach the Glasgow, not knowing who was who in the dark. The way it would work is captains would hail each other. They would shout out, "What ship are you?" And then they would expect to hear, "I'm the American frigate this, do you surrender, sir?" And so as the two ships approached in the night, the Cabot side by side with the Glasgow, once the British commander identified himself, the battle was initiated by a Marine in the fighting tops of the Cabot, lobbing a grenade onto the decks of the Glasgow, which exploded, and then the fight was on. Long story short, the Glasgow did an extraordinary job holding off 6 American warships who fought ineptly, because they had never fought as a combined force, a cohesive force. The Americans were not trained in how to fight as a fleet, or even in conjunction with another American ship. So in essence, what happened is they operated like they were privateers, and it was every ship for himself, which allowed the Glasgow, who took a severe beating, but she was able to escape and get to a friendly port to be able to repair herself. And that is one of the reasons why Aesop Hopkins was later relieved of his duties, because the Continental Conquerors was very disappointed with his performance in that fight. I'll pause there, but one final note there is that is where the first Continental Marine casualties of the war was sustained. One of those individuals was on board the Admiral's flagship. It was Second Lieutenant John Fitzpatrick, who was the second under Samuel Nicholas of the Marine Detachment on board the Alfred. And he took a musket round right to the head, died on the scene. And there were 3 other enlisted Marines on the other ships who were killed in that battle. First casualties of United States Marine Corps history.
Wow. And sir, can you kind of give us like a strategic level? What were the effects of these operations on the war as a whole?
Yeah, great question. So although the operation down in New Providence, Bahamas, did not have a lot of great success in terms of capturing the gunpowder that was needed, it did capture several ordnance items, but more importantly was the psychological impact that had on the British Empire, because they saw for the first time that the war was not going to be constricted to American shores alone. And the British at the time held strongholds throughout the world. They had colonies throughout the world. And what this one small operation demonstrated is that they now had to protect their holdings across the world, or risk them being captured, like what the ordnance items were and the cannons that were captured in the Bahamas. So that resulted in the British, although had an enormous fleet compared to the Americans, would now have to pull some assets off of the American coastline in order to protect their holdings in other parts of the world. The other thing that occurred is as the privateers became more effective and the Continental Navy started developing its own cadre of ships that were looking to capture British reinforcements and commerce coming over from the United States to reinforce and resupply their troops in America, that caused a situation where the Royal Navy now had to be more protective of those ships coming from England. So that's where they started to run convoys, which required warships to protect the convoys, which again drew assets off the American coast, which gave the Americans more opportunity to operate more freely and also to now allow its own commerce to occur with other countries throughout the world to continue to fund the war effort back in America.
So this seemed like a big force multiplier in a lot of ways.
It absolutely was, but it doesn't get a lot of fanfare like the big battles that Washington fought.
And actually with that, sir, the Marines do join Washington at some point. They don't stay at sea for the entire war.
That's correct. So if I could set the context, the siege of Boston concludes with General Howe evacuating Boston. Washington understands that the next target will be New York City. So he shifts the Continental Army down to New York City, and he has about 19,000 green troops defending New York. But the British come across the ocean with the largest fleet and the largest land force ever assembled to invade New York. They bring 32,000 troops. There's hundreds, literally hundreds of ships, manning 1,200 cannons, 10,000 sailors, and 2,000 British Marines against 19,000 green U.S. ground troops with no Navy. The Continental Navy did not come to Washington's aid during this time. He was on his own. He created his own naval force, similar to what he did in Boston, impressed soldiers to serve as sailors and Marines. But really, all they were doing was local security and dispatch messages being transferred using the waters as a venue to do that. So the outcome of this is inevitable. Washington gets defeated time and time again across New York. He crosses over into New Jersey, and then he gets chased by General Howe all the way across eastern New Jersey, south across the Delaware River in December of 1776. So that 19,000 soldiers that Washington started the New York campaign with had dwindled down to only around 2,500 that were left with him. And General Howe had over 10,000 troops ready to cross the Delaware River, capture the capital of Philadelphia, defeat Washington, and end the war. However, because it was December, it was late into the fighting season, Washington had effectively removed all the boats for miles from the ocean all the way up through miles past Philadelphia. So there was no means for the British to cross over into Pennsylvania to conclude the war. And the other thing that happened is they had fought a sustained campaign. They were tired. They were worn out. And European fighting tactics at the time was you don't fight during the winter. So General Howe placed his British and Hessian forces into 17 different cantonment sites across eastern New Jersey. That was for two reasons. One, to pacify the rebels in the area. It was to protect the loyalists in the area. But perhaps most importantly, it was to be able to sustain logistically these forces who had to feed themselves off of the land, because the privateers in the Continental Navy were cutting supplies off from coming across. What that did, though, is it isolated certain portions of the force. And the portion that was closest to the American were the Hessians located in Trenton and along the eastern shore of the Delaware River. Washington understood he had to re-seize the initiative from the enemy if he was to continue the fight. And if he wanted to continue the fight, he had to preserve the army. But his army had been dwindled through casualties, desertions, and disease, down to the number that I explained earlier. So he asked the Congress for assistance. One of the ways that the Congress assisted was they sent a group of individuals who were Philadelphia militia known as the Associators. A 1,200-man brigade under a guy named Cadwalder was sent to assist Washington. But the other thing Congress did was they assigned Samuel Nicholas, who was now in Philadelphia, where in December of 1775, the Continental Congress authorized the construction of the first 13 frigates. These would be the first 13 American warships built from the keel up for that purpose. The construction of those frigates was spread across the western seaboard. 4 of them were being constructed in Philadelphia: the Washington, the Delaware, the Effingham, and the Randolph. Samuel Nicholas, after they came back from the raid on New Providence, was put in charge of the recruitment effort to man the Marine detachments on these 4 frigates being constructed in Philadelphia. When Washington asked for assistance, they assigned Nicholas with taking the Mardettes off of those ships and again creating a battalion of Marines to go fight under the Continental Army and George Washington. So they were effectively detached from the Navy for a limited period of time to attach to the Continental Army to fight directly under General George Washington. Nicholas put his people on boats. They went upriver to Trenton. He met with Washington. And remember the conversation we had earlier about Washington wasn't necessarily a fan of Marines. He also didn't know how to employ Marines. So he was looking around. He's dealing with all these crises and challenges he's dealing with. And he looks over to General Cadwalader with the Associators and said, "General Cadwalader," at the time he was still a colonel, "I am placing the Continental Marine Battalion under your command, and I need you to tell me, do they mean to fight on the water, on the Delaware River, or are they here to fight on land?" And his response was, "Sir, they are here to fight with you and the Army." And so they did. They fought in the Battle of Trenton 1 as a supporting effort to establish a blocking position to prevent another Hessian gentleman named von Donop from reinforcing Rahl when Washington captured Trenton with his main force of Continental soldiers. And then in the Battle of Assunpink Creek, which otherwise known as Trenton II, they were right there at the principal point of the battle. And then they participated in the third battle in what would become known as the 10 Crucial Days at the Battle of Princeton, where the Marines were right in the heart of the battle. And George Washington was on the scene, ordering Nicholas to go back into the attack to counterattack the British forces under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mulhood. And the Marines did. They went into the counterattack, and as you know, that became an American victory. The interesting thing of the point was the Marines were there to fight for the duration of the campaign. The campaign did not end after the Battle of Princeton. Washington wanted to continue and achieve a 4th victory at New Brunswick, where Charles Lee, who had been earlier captured, was being held, and the British war chest was being held. But his people had reached their culminating point. They had been going for 40 hours straight in the wintertime, 9-mile hike through a blizzard, fought 3 major battles at this point. They were at a Schlitz. So Washington wisely took them up into Morristown in the New Jersey highlands and then commenced what was called the Forge Wars. And the Forge Wars were fought to prevent the British, still held up, who had evacuated all of eastern New Jersey after those 3 battles and were held up in Elizabethtown and Amboy, where they were closely tied to the Royal Fleet to be reinforced. But they still had to go out and find forage for their horses, and hence the term Forage War. Because as the British went out to find food and supplies, the Continental Marines and soldiers would ambush them, raid them, fight them in small-scale skirmishers in order to further attrite their forces and diminish their ability to resupply themselves. The interesting thing that happened here is many of the Continental Army enlistments were up at this time, and the gentleman in charge of General Washington's Continental Artillery Corps, known as Henry Knox, known by many, now had more cannons than he had soldiers to man them. So remember earlier when I talked about the versatility of Marines who would also operate ships' cannons at sea. Henry Knox looked around and he goes, "Wait a minute, don't those Marines know how to operate cannons?" The answer is yes. So Henry Knox specifically went to General Washington, requested that the battalion of Marines be assigned to the Continental Artillery, and for the remainder of the Forage War, the Continental Marines were the Continental Artillery Corps under the command of Henry Knox, until they were later sent back to Philadelphia to reboard their ships and again fight at sea.
That's amazing. That's super cool.
Yeah, Marines don't know that part of our history at all. I was amazed when I read that.
So on that note, actually, sir, is there anything we didn't cover that you think is important that Americans and Marines themselves should know about Marine Corps history, at this portion of Marine Corps history, that they might not know?
Well, I think the important thing to understand is the importance that and the enormous contribution that a small force can make to an overall effort. Over the course of the war, there were 231 officers and approximately 2,000 enlisted Marines. During the course of the war, 49 Marines gave their life in the service of our country, and 70 more were wounded. But they were participants in several of the major operations that occurred throughout the American Revolution, and many, many more of the small fights that people don't know because they weren't as large as the major battles, but still had an enormous contribution to the overall fight and the overall victory that America achieved during the American Revolution. And that same thing applies today. A small but powerful force under bold leadership can change the tide of war. And again, I think one of the people who demonstrated that most effectively was John Paul Jones, and how he employed his Marines during the American Revolution. Had an enormous impact well beyond the small force and contribution that he was able to make, but the psychological victory that he achieved in invading the British homeland was enormous.
I was going to ask about that, General. So this would be the John Paul Jones's raid on Whitehaven. So did the Continental Marines in fact have a battle honour on English soil? That's new to me, but I think would be fascinating for the British audience. If you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yes, that's absolutely right, Andrew. It was the raid at Whitehaven, and then they also landed in Scotland, where Jones's intent after conducting the raid at Whitehaven, where he intended to destroy several ships. He then followed on by landing in Scotland in order to capture a person of prominence. And his intent in doing that, and he was trying to capture an earl, and I believe the name was Shellback, if I forgive me if I got that incorrect. But his intent was to use him as leverage to try and free some American prisoners in a prisoner exchange. And so the Continental Marines were the majority of Jones's force who conducted those landings at Whitehaven and in Scotland. And then there were others that were operating. There was a guy named Lambert Wicks on the ship Reprisal who was there before Jones, who first started fighting in British waters, which created a lot of anxiety in the British homeland about where and when the Americans were going to strike.
Andrew, I would assume that that's not something that's commonly taught on your side of the ocean.
No, I mean, as we've spoken before, that the whole war is we go from the glorious victories of the 7 Years' War to the defeat of Napoleon, and for some reason there's less interest in losing a little empire on the other side of the Atlantic. But yeah, I mean that was I knew about the Whitehaven raid. I had no idea until this session that the Marines were involved in that. I mean, I know our Marines are they may have boasted once or twice about a little jaunt to Washington that they took at one point in the War of 1812. But I think with the Whitehaven raid, it's not the capital, but I think you've got a fairly good riposte to trot out there.
Another great story to tell later.
Well, sir, where can our listeners go if they're interested in finding more out about Continental Marines? Where can they go?
Well, I tell you, I think one of the best sources that exist out there for active duty Marines and really for all people is the Marine Corps Association. If you go to the Marine Corps Association website, they have actual training plans, they have videos, they have maps, they have all the materials that you need to do a battlefield study. to actually walk the ground. While I was still on active duty, I worked with them to develop those plans to be able to do battlefield engagements on the Trenton Princeton battlefield. So enormous opportunities there for folks right there at the tip of your fingers. If you're looking for a primary source material, there are two books, and actually this is the definitive volume on the Marines in the Revolution. This was written by a guy named Colonel Charles, who was actually an Army officer who was hired by the Marine Corps. And this was written in 1976 for the bicentennial. And so now I'm happy to report, that we have a follow-on to this in writing in Washington's Marines. And then my next work, which I hope to have published in the next year, will be referred to as America's Marines. And that will consist of focusing more on the war at sea and on the rivers. And just like Washington's Marines focused on the 10 crucial days for the second half of the book, the second half of America's Marines will focus on the Penobscot expedition of 1779. And greatest naval defeat in American history for 164 years, all the way until the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. We lost 42 ships in that engagement. But the only, and I'm being a little parochial myself here, the only shining light in that expedition was whenever the Marines led the effort. They captured an island. They captured a British firing position. They scaled a 200-foot wall after conducting an amphibious assault under enemy fire. They were pushing forward and ready to capture the principal army base of the British at the time, called Fort George. The commander of the British actually had his hand on the lanyard, ready to pull the flag of surrender. The Marines were so aggressively moving towards their objective. But the overarching land commander was a Massachusetts militia brigadier general named Lovell, and Lovell ceased all forward movement and decided to put Fort George under siege, which ultimately resulted in the defeat of the American expedition. So that's coming out. And then the other principal primary source reference is there are 13 volumes of what's called Naval Documents of the American Revolution that had been published by the Navy. And this has every document you can think of, primary source material from 1775 all the way through the conclusion of the war. And it has been a principal source of material for me, and it's just a wealth of knowledge and really golden nuggets in there that you find.
Awesome. Well, Major General Jason Bohm, thank you very much for joining us. We really, really appreciate it. This was awesome, and happy birthday.
Thank you. Yeah, my pleasure, gentlemen. I wanted to say how much I appreciate all of you in helping to not only keep American history alive, but also our brothers and sisters over there in Great Britain as well. We're so thankful to have you as partners in today's environment. That alliance remains strong. It was great to see the president over there recently and engaging with the king and the prime minister. So God bless you all in England and Great Britain, and God bless America, and Semper Fidelis all.
Murmurs in the Camp is a segment of our show where we answer questions and discuss topics that you, our listeners, want to hear about. If you have a question or topic that you want to submit to Murmurs in the Camp, call or text our Murmurs in the Camp voicemail box at 716-299-8426. That's 716-299-8426.
Hey guys, Jimmy from Remus, Michigan. Very cool rifle episode. I know commanders tended to be more concerned with rate of fire over the slow accuracy, so I wonder why there weren't more innovations in a faster firing musket. Seems like mass, continuous fire was the focus and a decisive factor, and the ultimate future. Developments in this area might have kept rifles on the fringe. Were there any progress in practical rapid fire?
Well, thanks for calling in, Jimmy. I'll say a few words about this, and then we've actually got Dr. John Weaver back with us in the studio in order to help answer this question. So, throughout the 18th century, there are a number of incremental improvements in things like the quality of gunpowder and flints that help make rifles or muskets, more reliable. But there are also a number of significant moments in the 18th century in terms of trying to actively produce a faster loading musket. And the most significant of these that happens before the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War for us here in America, is the adoption of metal and usually iron ramrods that was done across European armies and completed roughly by the start of the 7 Years' War. There are a few holdouts that have wooden ramrods still, but that helps the men load the weapons a little bit more effectively. Helps the sort of power through the loading as fouling starts to build up in the barrel a little bit more effectively. It's not a perfect solution. Wooden ramrods break, but metal ramrods sometimes bend in a way that's hard to bend them back. So it's not a perfect solution, but it is a step in the right direction. And the Prussians adopt this, and other European nations quickly follow suit in order to kind of keep this process, sort of maintain technological parity with their opponents. I will say also, after the 7 Years' War, there are a couple of significant improvements in muskets, and those are the cylindrical ramrod and the conical touch hole. These basically, the first allows, when you're withdrawing the ramrod from the musket and inserting it in the mouth or the barrel of the musket, you no longer have to reverse the ramrod. So you can just draw it out and put it immediately back in. So maybe a second or so is saved while you're trying to sort of fiddle with it and take the enlarged end and put it down in the barrel. So that's one practical improvement. The other practical improvement is a self-priming musket, and this is the conical touch hole. So you rip off the cartridge with your teeth and you pour the cartridge down into the barrel of the musket or the mouth of the musket, and shutting the pan just by dumping powder down the barrel and then ramming down the cartridge. The powder is self-priming, so you no longer have to complete that separate priming step. And there are videos, I think, both on YouTube and on Facebook of an Austrian reenactor firing a reproduction of an Austrian musket that has both of these features, both a sort of cylindrical ramrod that you don't have to reverse, and a conical touch hole that you are able to sort of self-prime the weapon just by ramming down the cartridge. And he's able to fire extremely quickly by the standards of 18th century warfare. Now, Prussians and others who sort of adopt these modifications in mass sometimes claim that, well, yeah, you can fire like 12 times a minute now. It's incredibly helpful in producing an increased rate of fire. In combat, obviously, the actual rate of fire is going to be a lot less than it is on the drill square, but these are significant improvements that do allow for a faster rate of fire. As you kind of pointed out, though, Jimmy, that faster rate of fire can also lead to musket shots that are maybe a little bit less accurate or less well aimed. And so this is why some armies, like the British Army, continue to prioritize aimed fire as opposed to really going all in on these sort of innovations and improvements to the musket that just facilitate the men firing as fast as they possibly can. Anything you'd want to add for us there, Jack, about the story of how muskets change in the 18th century?
Well, I would say, too, it's not just the technology of the musket itself, but the tactics. Platoon fire, of course, is an innovation that produces much faster fire without having to change any technology at all. Certainly, having a metal rammer allows you to produce more fast platoon fire, but there is that trade-off of speed and accuracy. I don't think you don't really get both of them together in a single gun until the 19th century with the invention of the Minet ball and the rifle musket, which isn't really adopted by European armies and the U.S. Army until the 1850s and 60s. So in sort of the pre-American Civil War and for the British Crimean War era, they're working at a level of technology that allows for innovations like the conical touch hole and the cylindrical rammer to shave kind of seconds or fractions of seconds off loading time, but they're still working with a weapon that by later standards is still fairly limited in how fast it can fire, and you can only train to load and fire it so fast, and combat conditions are going to detract from that.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with a link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date on the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, formerly known as X. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gugino, music by Brianna Tam, Artie Sun, and Adrian Berenegger. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.